Where's the mic here? Yeah, the mic. Look at him.
His name is Isaiah.
Dude, you found like a teenage. You sound like a 50-year-old.
No.
Well, I don't have a voice. I sound like a 50-year-old.
Then that means you're gonna have one.
Save me. Skip.
Dramatic. Wait, y'all speak Arabic?
Normal voice.
I am.
No, you're not. You're acting like you're like. You never voiced that.
Not kind of.
Green light.
Oh my gosh, this is hard. This is hard. Wow, why?
Green light. Red light.
Bro.
Red light.
What?
Green light. Red light. Green light. Red light.
I am number Sigma.
Green light. Red light. Green light. Green light. Red light. Green light. Green light. Red light.
Let me show you how to block this ad. First,
Green light.
perfection. This is your brain when you're struggling.
Ready to unlock
Green light, green.
Here are the most epic last stands in history. Number 1, the Attack of the Dead Men. Okay, we're starting off with one of the most disturbing last stands of World War I, and honestly, this was probably the closest thing to a real-life zombie encounter. It's 1915, and the horrors of modern warfare are on full display throughout Europe in the Great War. New weapons are being deployed into combat on a daily basis with horrific, never-before-seen results, and this story is no exception. The German army has begun its advance into the Eastern Front and has its sights set on Ozovik Fortress, a stronghold near the western border of the Russian Empire. This fortress was an extremely important choke point, as it controlled one of the only rail lines into the area. The Germans had been attempting to take Ozovik since the previous year, but had met heavy resistance from the Russian defenders stationed there. Though often outnumbered 10-1, the Russians have managed to hold the fort through 2 aggressive assaults with a fighting force of only around 900 soldiers and militia. By late summer, German Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg demanded that Ozovik be taken by any means necessary. And so, on August 6th, when the winds were favorable, the Germans unleashed a horrific new weapon on the men within the fortress walls. At 4 a.m., the Germans began firing their artillery at the fortress, and the Russian defenders braced for impact. They'd lived through this before, and it seemed like another routine bombardment. But on this morning, a mysterious green fog slowly began to creep its way past the trenches and into the fort. When the mist reaches the Russians, their eyes begin to burn. They start coughing uncontrollably, and as they take painful breaths of the green fog, their lungs quickly fill with blood. In a panic, a soldier turns and sees his comrade collapsing to the ground in a painful coughing fit, blood streaming from his eyes, nose, and mouth. The Germans had used chlorine gas against the helpless defenders, which on contact with soft tissue turns into hydrochloric acid. The Russians had no gas masks and were literally being dissolved alive by the deadly green fog. Men stationed near the back of the fort scrambled to douse pieces of cloth with water and urine and wrap their faces in a desperate attempt to survive the gas attack. But it proved futile, and within minutes the 900 defenders all appeared to be dead on the ground. An hour or so later, the Germans donned their gas masks and began their march into the fort. As they neared the trenches, they were greeted by the horrifying effectiveness of their new chemical weapon. Bodies of dead Russian soldiers lay twisted in agony, all seeming to have passed choking on their own blood. Their hopeless attempts at makeshift face masks stained red cling to their faces. Their blinded eyes, raw like ground meat, stare into the sky, unable to be closed again. These German soldiers had never experienced the horrors of chemical warfare up close and are completely disturbed by its inhumane results. But as they march into the fort, they begin to hear rustling from amongst the dead bodies. Haunting groans followed by gurgling deep coughs begin to echo throughout the fort, and slowly, one by one, the once dead Russian soldiers begin to drag themselves to their feet. The Germans step back in disbelief as they watch the corpses of the defenders seemingly come back to life, blood streaming from their eyes and nose, and their painful coughs send bloody pieces of lung flying out of their mouths. The undead Russians, clutching their bayonets, slowly begin lurching forward as if possessed by vengeance itself. Suddenly, defensive artillery fire echoes out, and the Germans look up to see more undead men manning the cannons. The reanimated Russians begin charging at the Germans, who all turn and run in a full-blown panic. The undead defenders open fire on the fleeing German soldiers, and hundreds are shot down. Some are so desperate to flee from the sight of these unholy warriors that they impale themselves on the barbed wire lining the trenches, and many more are trampled to death by fellow soldiers running in horror. The German army retreats from Ozovik, and the siege is called off. The fortress remains in Russian hands. Though the 60 or so Russian defenders who survived the gas attack most likely met their end shortly following their last stand, they lived long enough to see Ozovik successfully defended for one final time. The fort was never taken by force. Instead, the Russians dismantled it in a strategic retreat a few weeks later.
Yes! Die in the name of the Emperor, heretic scum!
Cut! Hey, guys, we can't be gaming on set, remember?
Oh, sorry, boss. But this game, Warhammer 40,000
Boss fight?
Hi!
Zarinsky. 4-decade reign offers one of the greatest empires in history. Under the leadership of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans have steamrolled their way westward and now find themselves on the doorstep of Europe. He sets his sights on Vienna, the last line of defense to the European continent and home to the rulers of the mighty Habsburg Empire. Throughout his 4-decade reign, Suleiman has truly lived up to his nickname, but now in his 70s, his health has begun to fail. If he was to make a play to invade Europe, it needs to be done now. So on April 29, 1566, he assembles his army and begins his final march towards Vienna. But on his way there, his troops run up on this small fortress called Sigedvar that refuses to surrender. The fortress is commanded by a man who'd been a constant thorn in his side, the Croatian Count Nikola Zrinski. Now by this time, Zrinski and Suleiman were very familiar with each other. Zrinski had played a key role in defending Vienna when the Ottomans first attacked in 1529 and had been a part of many successful defenses against Suleiman's forces. As a faithful Christian, he hated the Ottomans and had devoted his life to guarding Europe from their rule. Knowing that Zrinski was stationed at this fortress, Suleiman orders his men to stop and set up camp. They'll take Sigedvar in a few days and crush this annoying pest once and for all before marching on Vienna. So on August 1st, Zrinski looks out at this mass of Ottoman soldiers piling up across the moat of his fortress, and he knows things are going to get bad real quick. He has with him just 2,300 Croatian and Hungarian defenders. Even if he were to send for reinforcements, they would still be no match for such an enormous army. More likely than not, his fate is sealed. But perhaps not the fate of Vienna and the Habsburgs. While he may not survive the upcoming siege, there's a chance he can stop Suleiman here and ensure he never reaches Vienna. Zrinski calls his men together, who by this time had all seen the Ottoman army outside their fort. He reminds them that it's their duty to fight to the last man against these invaders, and that he'll personally shoot any coward or deserter. Unsurprisingly, they all swear to defend the fort to the end. Now, to really get a feel for this epic battle to come, you have to understand the weirdness of the Sikitvar fortress. See, Sikitvar was in fact 3 islands, each with a separate fort: the New Town, the Old Town, and the Citadel. The only way to the Old Town is on a bridge from the New Town, and the only way to the Citadel is the bridge from the Old Town. If the Ottomans want to take the fortress, they'll have to break through Zrinski's defenses 3 times, and he was planning to make it as painful as possible.
Need help doing your own taxes? Switch to H&R Block and get free unlimited expert help.
I need to order some food, but I'm in the middle of a game. Let's use Lifer, an app that integrates with the game that you're playing to order food from the cheapest delivery service available. I'm going to order food quickly without leaving the game or getting my squad defeated. Select some of your favorite food from millions of restaurants. I'm going to order some tacos while we
Suleiman's entire army shows up to Sikitvar on August 5th, and the sheer mass of men is a terrifying sight for the defenders. 100,000 soldiers and 300 cannons surround the fortress. But in defiance, the defenders drape bright red cloth from the fortress walls, sarcastically welcoming the Sultan's men as guests of honor, followed by a single cannon shot fired directly at the Ottoman army. A message so clear that it needs no translator. If you want this fort, you'll have to come and take it. The Ottoman siege begins on August 6th, and their cannons quickly rip apart the new town. Against all odds, Zrinski's defenders are able to return fire and successfully stop the first assault, inflicting heavy casualties on the Ottoman attackers. But this victory is short-lived, and a large part of the new town walls crumbles on August 9th, forcing Nicola's troops to retreat across the bridge into the old town. Despite his rapidly deteriorating health, Suleiman personally arrives to Sikitvar the same day. He wants to be there to see Zrinski's death with his own eyes. The Ottomans quickly set up their forces in the new town and begin their assault on the old town on August 10th. Cannons and artillery pepper the walls of the fort from all directions, and Suleiman's generals order full assaults at the old town main gates. Zrinski's forces repel the unrelenting assault 10 times, inflicting heavy casualties on the invaders, but ultimately the old town falls on August 19th, and Zrinski's men are forced back into the citadel. Some of his troops near the front line are jumped as they're rushing towards the final bridge and are forced to watch in despair as the gates close on them. By this point, the Ottomans have sustained far greater losses than they anticipated, but Zrinski's forces have suffered greatly as well. Only 600 of the 2,300 defenders have survived. Suleiman, sensing his time was short, begins to send messages to Zrinski asking him to surrender. He promises him rule over all Croatia if he just gives up and turns his back on the Habsburgs. But his offer falls on deaf ears. With no response, the Ottomans begin to fire letters into the citadel, promising Zrinski's troops that if they surrender, their lives will be spared, but not a single man leaves. With diplomacy a complete fail, the Ottomans resume their assault and manage to blow a massive hole into the wall of the citadel. Buildings on the last island catch on fire in the explosion, and Zrinski and his men steel themselves for a final defense. But surprisingly, no attack comes. See, unknown to the defenders, a wave of dysentery has swept through the Ottoman camp, probably from drinking the nasty-ass water around the fortress. Suleiman himself, who is already incredibly frail, reportedly contracts the same infection and dies in his tent on September 6th. His commanders issue no orders that day and keep his death a secret from everyone, afraid that after such heavy losses, the rest of their army may begin deserting if they know their sultan is also dead. But Zrinski and his men are not granted much time to rest. On September 7th, the day after Suleiman's death, the Ottoman army makes a final push to take the citadel. Greek fire spreads on the walls, setting the fort on fire, and cannonballs and arrows rain into the fortress onto the hapless defenders. Realizing they have no chance of victory, Zrinski gathers his remaining men and says, "Let us go out from this burning place into the open and stand up to our enemies. Who dies, he will be with God. Who dies not, his name will be honored. I will go first, and what I do, you do. And God is my witness, I will never leave you, my brothers and knights." Zrinski and his men push one of their last mortars to the front gate. Without warning, they fling it open, startling the Ottoman soldiers waiting on the bridge and fire directly into their formation. He then leads his remaining 600 men in a final charge out of the fort and down the bridge. The defenders of Sikitvar will go out in a final blaze of glory. Zrinski, leading the pack, is hit with a bullet and then another and slumps to the ground dead. His men stream around their beloved commander, shouting their battle cries as they engage the enemy. Their final charge does not last long, and they are all soon put down. The Ottomans, sensing victory is at hand, charge into the open gates of the citadel, eager to take out the remaining defenders. But instead of defenders, they're greeted by a single wounded soldier sitting on the ground holding a torch. When the Ottomans reach him, he lights the remaining gunpowder supply, triggering a massive explosion, killing another 3,000 of the Sultan's men. What was supposed to be a short detour on their triumphant march to Vienna had instead cost the Ottoman Empire over 20,000 men and their Sultan. Suleiman's successors would never reach Vienna, and his death at Sigetvar marked the beginning of the downfall of the empire itself. Number 3. The Battle of Sargari.
If your project management tool doesn't show you everything in one place, you're missing the bigger picture. Motion gives you full visibility.
The closing years of the 19th century, and in an area of the Indian northwest frontier, the British Indian Army have found themselves under increasing attacks from local Afghan tribes. Though once allies to the crown, these tribes have begun to sour on the increasing British presence in the area, and now see the encroachment as a violation of their sovereignty. To defend their newly acquired territory, the British Indian Army had repurposed forts built by the conquered Sikh Empire near the Khyber Pass, and stationed members of the 36th Sikhs, an infantry regiment made up of Sikh soldiers from the Punjab region, to man these forts. In the fall of 1897, two forts in particular, Fort Gulliston and Fort Lockhart, find themselves under heavy assault from these tribes. Despite being outnumbered, the British Indian forces had been able to beat back the tribes each time, leaving them frustrated and looking for an easier target. And this is when they set their sights on a small outpost in the tiny village of Sargari. See, the two forts were miles apart and communicated through a Morse code via a signaling station in a small fort in Sargari. Messages from Gulliston were sent to Sargari, which was then sent to Fort Lockhart and vice versa. The Afghan tribesmen realized that if they knocked out the signaling station, the two forts would no longer be able to coordinate their defensive reinforcements properly. Now, Sargari was barely a village, and the signaling station rarely saw any action, so just 21 men were stationed there. Despite being on the front line, this outpost was boring AF. But all this changed on the morning of September 12, 1897, when the soldier manning the signaling tower spots a horde of Afghan tribesmen suddenly appear on the horizon. He quickly sends a message to Fort Lockhart that Sargari is under attack and requests reinforcements, but the reply is swift, and it sinks the hearts of all men stationed there. All available forces are too far away, and the other forts can't be left unmanned. No reinforcements will be coming. Fort Lockhart then signals Sargari they count an estimated 10,000 tribesmen bearing down on their location. It's at this point, Havildar Ishar Singh, commander of the outpost, instructs his 20 soldiers that they'll fight to the end and do their best to stop the advancing horde. Though they will most likely die here today, they may be able to buy enough time for reinforcements to reach the other two forts. Staring death in the face, each man solemnly accepts his fate and springs into action. They quickly reinforce the gates to the fort, taking their positions on top of the wall, and wait anxiously as the giant wave of tribesmen gets closer and closer. The soldier stationed at the signaling tower remains at his post, observing the action, and will send updates to Fort Lockhart through the entire engagement. At 9 a.m., the tribesmen rush the fort, and the fighting begins. The Sikh are deadly marksmen, and the advancing tribesmen quickly begin to fall. But no matter how many bullets find their mark, the mass of attackers doesn't seem to change. From the sea of bodies, the tribesmen fire back at the soldiers on the wall and manage to kill one of the defenders. Against all odds, the Sikhs push back the first wave, and the tribesmen retreat and regroup. There's little time to celebrate as another wave of Afghans soon begins storming the fort. The Sikhs take out more attackers, but the tribesmen are closer and manage to take out more defenders with small arms fire from the ground. Every defender lost is a huge blow to a fighting force of just 21 men. But they sell their lives at the highest price, each taking out dozens of tribesmen before meeting their end. Eventually, the Afghans, quickly growing tired of being murked so effectively, begin shouting out to the Sikhs, "We offer you wealth and safety, just give up the outpost!" But their bribes are quickly answered with bullets. The tribesmen, frustrated with their failed attempts at both siege and diplomacy, begin to set the brush around the fort on fire, creating a dense veil of black smoke. The defenders struggle to see their enemy in the darkness when the signalman sees a frantic message being signaled from Fort Lockhart. The tribesmen have used the cover of the smoke to sneak around the fort to the undefended signaling tower and are making their way in. The wall near the signaling tower is soon breached, and screaming tribesmen begin to flood into the fort. Ishar sends some of the remaining men to defend against the breach, but this leaves the front gates vulnerable, and soon tribesmen have broken through and begin flooding in from the front. Running low on ammunition, the Sikhs resort to bayonets and swords. The men in Fort Lockhart helplessly watch through spyglasses as brutal hand-to-hand combat erupts within the fortress walls. The Sikh soldiers fight on bravely against impossible odds, but one by one begin to fall. Ishar commands his remaining men to retreat into the inner walls. As they run past him, he defiantly stands in the way of their attackers. His final moments are spent heroically engaging the horde of tribesmen, buying his men just enough time to retreat and lock the gates behind them. With Ishar slain, the Afghan mob storms to the inner walls. The defenders spend the little ammo they have left, but it's no use. Within minutes, the final gates protecting the survivors are broken and the remaining Sikhs are all brutally killed. The only man left in Sargari is the lone soldier in the signaling tower, who at this point sends his final message to Fort Lockhart. Permission to take up my rifle. The commander of Fort Lockhart solemnly closes his eyes and replies, "Granted." He watches the signalman neatly pack up his equipment into a leather pouch and affix his bayonet to his rifle. The lone survivor then proceeds to take out 40 more tribesmen who try to attack his position. The men in Lockhart cheer him on with every kill, but the last ounce of hope is soon lost when a thick black smoke engulfs the tower. The tribesmen had set fire to the tower itself, and the last defender in Sargari is burned alive, shouting the Sikh battle cry for all to hear.
One will be blessed eternally. Who says that God is the ultimate truth?
The last stand at Sargari lasted 6 hours, and against all odds, the 21 brave Sikh soldiers managed to buy enough time for reinforcements to arrive at the two forts the following day. And when the tribesmen attempted to attack the forts, they were easily beaten back. The British forces reclaimed the remains of the Sargari signaling outpost and found the mutilated bodies of the 21 men surrounded by over 600 dead tribesmen. Havildar Ishar and his men stationed at Sargari were posthumously awarded the Indian Order of Merit, the highest award an Indian soldier could receive at the time and was equivalent to the Victoria Cross. Thanks again to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to download it and try it out today.
This was me, struggling to keep up with posting consistently on YouTube and getting less views than normal, until I found Spotter Studio. Spotter Studio is an AI software built to help YouTubers come up with video.
Here are the most epic 1v1 fights in human history. Number 1, Jean de Carouge versus Jacques Legris. We're gonna start off with one of the most brutal 1v1 fights in recorded history when jealousy turned best friends into mortal enemies who end up fighting to the death. It's the late 14th century in France, and two men named Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris are squires serving under a local count in Lower Normandy. This is smack dab in the middle of the 100 Years' War, so Jean and Jacques often find themselves fighting side by side against the English. Their time together on the battlefield leads to a strong friendship. So strong, in fact, that when Jean's wife gives birth to his first son, he asks Jacques to become the child's godfather. So life is good for Jean, but things begin to sour when the count they've been serving under dies, and the position is inherited by a man named Pierre d'Alençon. Both Jean and Jacques, having been loyal subjects, are invited to join the new count's inner circle. Nice! But for some reason, he begins to heavily favor Jacques over Jean. The favoritism makes Jean insanely jealous, and this jealousy quickly destroys their friendship. On top of this, around the same time, Jean's wife and his young son fall ill and pass away. Heartbroken and lost, and with no reason to stick around in Normandy, Jean decides to get away from it all and goes off to England to fight in the 100 Years' War. Tales of his bravery make it back to France, and when he returns home, Jean is kind of a war hero. He meets and marries a beautiful young noble named Marguerite de Thibauville. Things are finally starting to look up again for our guy. But this marriage turns out to be the thing that ultimately ends the friendship between Jean and Jacques for good. See, by this time, the two former friends haven't seen each other in years. But with Jean back in town planning to settle down again with his new wife, they both end up at a party celebrating the birth of a neighbor's son. They bump into each other and get to talking, and they kind of remember why they were such good friends long ago. I know, like, why are we even mad at each other anyway? Oh, by the way, this is my wife Marguerite. Bro, I'm like right here. Jacques is immediately attracted to Marguerite, and now he's jealous of Jean. But she's the wife of his friend, who is kind of like not his friend anymore, but is kind of his friend again. What is he gonna do? Well, what he ends up doing is actually pretty f***ed up. See, Jean needs to earn more money, so he decides to go off to fight the English again. Only this time, his campaign is a complete failure. Against all odds, he somehow survives, and for his bravery, he's knighted by the King of France, and he has to travel to Paris to collect his wages from the campaign. At the exact same time, Jean's mother has to go on a business trip. They all live together in a huge estate, by the way, and when she leaves, she takes all of the servants and guards with her, leaving Jean's new wife, Marguerite, all alone at home. Now, Jacques hears about this and goes to Jean's home. He sends one of his man-at-arms to knock on the door, and Marguerite, left without any servants or guards, opens the door herself. The soldier tells her that Jacques is here, and he's desperately in love with her and needs to see her right now. She refuses, but as she tries to close the door, Jacques forces his way in and... oh boy.
Here's how the average man's life would change if he never saw an ad again. Day 1, he would install...
Let's just say he does the thing that rhymes with the word grapes? Violated, Marguerite is on the floor crying, and as he leaves, Jacques threatens her, saying if she tells anyone, she's dead. Jean returns home, and Marguerite tells him everything. He's furious and immediately files a criminal case against Jacques. But guess who the judge is? That D-bag Count Pierre, Jacques' new best friend, and the case is thrown out immediately. Jean goes to Paris to appeal the case to the King of France himself. He shows the people in Paris that Marguerite is now pregnant. I mean, come on! But this doesn't do much because common knowledge of the day says that it was impossible to get pregnant from... grapes? With no witnesses other than Marguerite and Jacques, the courts say that they have no way to determine who's telling the truth. So Jean demands a trial by combat, an archaic form of judgment where two men fight to the death to see who's correct. If the courts can't decide who's telling the truth, they'll let God decide by shining fortune on one of them. Jacques is also pissed that his name is getting dragged through the mud, so he countersues Jean for defamation and agrees to the duel. Now, by this time in France, trial by combat was considered pretty barbaric and not something civilized people should be doing. But the king, he's actually super into the idea. Like, so much so that when there's a chance he might miss the fight, he pushes the whole event back to make sure he can be there. So, on December 29th, 1386, the king, along with a crowd of nobles and spectators, gather at the Abbey of Saint-Martin-de-Champs in Paris to witness these two former friends fight to the death. Marguerite is also there, dressed in black, as today may also be her funeral. If Jean loses, it will mean that God has decided she was lying and she would be burned at the stake as punishment. Before the bout begins, official orders from the king are read to the crowd. Throughout the event, no one is to say a word. If anyone does, they'll have a hand cut off as punishment. You can't have anyone putting curses on the combatants and clouding God's judgment after all. Both men are dressed in full steel plated armor and carry into the arena the holy trinity of weapons: a lance, a battle axe, and a longsword, along with a long dagger. The battle will begin on horseback and continue until one man submits or dies. The two men mount their horses at opposite ends of the arena and are handed their lances. The trial of combat begins, and the two men charge towards each other and strike the shields of their opponent. Both reeling, they ready for a second pass, and this time both men strike each other in the helmet. Their ears ringing, they charge again for a third pass, again striking each other's shields, splintering their lances in the process. They turn their horses and draw their battle axes and charge in for a fourth pass, and this time Jacques swings his axe and cuts the neck of Jean's horse, killing it instantly. Jean tumbles to the ground. He scrambles back to his feet, turns and swings his axe, slicing the belly of Jacques' horse, who collapses, throwing Jacques to the ground. The two men draw their swords and charge at each other, swinging with evil intent. Jacques is the much larger man, and he quickly begins to gain the upper hand in the duel. He's battering Jean, who's struggling to defend against the powerful blows of his one-time friend. He can only withstand the beating for so long until Jacques finds an opening and stabs Jean in his thigh. The crowd gasps as this fight may soon be coming to an end, and Jacques steps back and looks up towards the spectators. With this small opening, Jean lunges at Jacques and drags him to the ground by his helmet. Lying flat on his back, Jacques cannot stand with his heavy armor weighing him down. Jean mounts him and begins viciously stabbing at his chest with his sword, but as hard as he tries, he cannot pierce the steel plating. He throws his sword to the side and takes out his dagger, and with its handle, he begins to smash at the lock that secures Jacques' faceplate. A final strike breaks the lock and he rips off the helmet, revealing the face of his one-time best friend. Holding a knife to his throat, Jean demands that Jacques confess to his crimes. Jacques defiantly screams, "In the name of God and on the peril and damnation of my soul, I am innocent."
What?
With this, Jean can stomach no more disrespect and plunges his dagger into the neck of his former friend, killing him instantly. The crowd erupts into cheers, and pages rush onto the field to treat Jean's wounded leg. Jean limps and kneels in front of the king, who's like, "That was f***ing epic!" He gives Jean a prize of 1,000 francs, worth about $300,000 today, and a royal payment of 200 francs a month, which is around 60K in today's money. Jean then limps to his wife Marguerite, and together they ride in a caravan to the Notre Dame Cathedral to give thanks to God for the long-awaited justice. They then live happily ever after for about 10 years, and then Jean goes off and dies in a crusade. Bro just couldn't retire. Number 2, Miyamoto Musashi versus Sasaki Kojiro. It's not often we get to see two legendary fighters go up against each other in their primes, but this is exactly what happened in this story when Miyamoto Musashi went up against the most skilled swordsman of his time, Sasaki Kojiro, in an epic duel to the death. The date is April 13th, 1612, and on the shore of a small island off the coast of southern Honshu called Ganryujima, a samurai is silently seething in anger as he watches the sun begin to fall in the afternoon sky. He's a tall, powerful man who towers over his disciples, and on his shoulder, he's carrying a giant 3-foot-long sword called a nodachi, a weapon so big, only someone his size could even dream of using it properly. His name is Sasaki Kojiro, a man many at the time considered to be the most skilled swordsman in all of Japan. Months ago, he was challenged to a duel by a ronin named Miyamoto Musashi, and he's impatiently awaiting for his arrival. Musashi is late, and Kojiro is taking it personally. The inconsiderate behavior goes completely against the code of the samurai. The sun continues to set, and finally, a whole 3 hours later, a small boat appears on the horizon, casually drifting in the distance. Musashi is finally here, and Kojiro impatiently rushes to meet him at the shore. Now, Musashi, unlike Kojiro, who is a proper by-the-book samurai, is kind of a weirdo. For one thing, he's super tall for the time, standing nearly 6 feet when most Japanese men of the era were only around 5 feet. His appearance is also very un-samurai-like. His face and clothing are dirty, he never bathes, and his hair is an uncombed mess. Despite all these oddities, Musashi is known throughout the land to be not only dangerous, but also an incredibly cunning warrior. By the age of 29, he had already fought and won 60 duels to the death, killing his first opponent at the age of 13, and he's currently wandering Japan seeking out and challenging the best swordsman he can find to test his skills with the katana. Musashi is well aware of Kojiro's immense talent and knows that this fight will be his greatest challenge to date. The winner today will undoubtedly be deemed the greatest swordsman in all of Japan. Knowing the stakes, he's gone to great lengths to make sure he's given himself every possible advantage in this duel. Musashi nonchalantly steps off the boat looking as dirty and disheveled as ever. He sees Kojiro's face and smirks. Kojiro is fuming after waiting 3 hours for his arrival. Musashi then reveals his chosen weapon for the duel, a crudely carved wooden sword that he had made out of a boat oar. Instead of showing up on time, he had spent the 3 hours carving this thing on the ride over to the island. Seeing this enrages Kojiro even more. Musashi's not even giving him the respect of facing him with his infamous two-sword style, and instead is planning to fight him with this? Without the standard bow to begin the duel, Kojiro begins yelling at Musashi, scolding him for being so late. This disrespect will not go unpunished, and he unsheathes his sword and throws the scabbard to the ground, signaling this will be a duel to the death. Musashi casually comments, "You have already lost if you think you don't need your sheath anymore," and he lifts his wooden sword into a ready position. Kojiro, now fully blinded by rage, charges in using his signature technique called the swallow cut. Musashi barely dodges, and his headband is sliced off his head. He jumps away and positions himself with the setting sun at his back. The late afternoon sun reflecting off the water blinds Kojiro, and he squints to try to keep track of his opponent. Seeing this opening, Musashi heaves his wooden sword and with all his might strikes Kojiro with a blow to his head. Kojiro cannot defend himself properly, and the sound of his skull cracking echoes on the beach, leaving his disciples gasping in shock as his limp body falls lifelessly to the sand. the greatest samurai duel in history is over in just one strike. Musashi, seeing Kojiro's disciples beginning to go from shock to anger, quickly jumps back on his boat and his oarsman brings him back to the main island with no celebration. Now, you may be saying, okay, that's pretty epic and all, but what was up with the boat oar? Well, that was actually part of Musashi's plan too. He had learned of Kojiro's giant odachi, and knowing he could not beat him with his standard katana, he carved his wooden sword to be 2 inches longer than Kojiro's weapon, taking away his greatest advantage. Musashi had carefully planned every aspect of the fight, from his late arrival, which he expected to upset Kojiro, positioning himself with the sun to his back to blind him, and his wooden sword, giving him the reach he needed to strike safely at a distance. With this victory, he's proven that he was not only the greatest swordsman in all of Japan, but also one of the greatest tacticians as well. Number 3. Andrew Jackson versus Charles Dickinson. Here in the US, we have a history of electing unhinged psychopaths to the office of the president. And out of everyone who's ever been commander-in-chief, I think Andrew Jackson is probably the craziest person we ever put in there. The guy allegedly participated in over 100 duels, and this story is probably the best example of why you don't ever want to get into a gunfight with a crazy person. Back in 1805, former Tennessee Senator Andrew Jackson is out at the racetracks betting big on his prize horse Truxton. He's supposed to go up against another horse named Plowboy, owned by this guy Joseph Irwin. The winning horse was to take home $2,000, big money for the time, and Jackson was confident his horse was going to win. But days before the race, Irwin's horse gets sick and can't run. The men get into a disagreement about how much money Jackson should get from this situation, and most likely, Jackson is being a complete asshole, as he was known to be. Irwin's son-in-law, Charles Dickinson, hears of this and steps in. Dickinson, like Jackson, has a huge ego and a hot temper, and it doesn't take long before the two start slinging insults at each other in private letters and out in public. Dickinson calls Jackson a worthless scoundrel in one letter, and later at a party, he goes on talking shit about Jackson's wife, saying Jackson is getting some guy's leftovers as his wife hadn't even divorced her first husband yet. That one really pisses off Jackson because, well, it was true. Dickinson pops off one last time, writing an article in the local newspaper calling Jackson a poltroon and a coward. Sick burns! And this one sends Jackson off the rails. 3 insults is just too much for him to handle, and he formally challenges Dickinson to a duel. Now, Dickinson is actually totally cool with this, because it's well known that he's an expert marksman with a pistol. Actually, probably one of the best shots in the state. So he accepts the challenge with full confidence he's gonna put that asshole Jackson down for good. Meanwhile, Jackson and his friend, knowing that Dickinson is a way better shot, try to come up with all kinds of harebrained schemes to increase Jackson's chances of winning. They come up with a plan of trying to get Dickinson to shoot first, because maybe they can rush him and he'll miss, and then Jackson would have all the time he needs to aim properly. This strategy did have the risk of Dickinson, not missing, and Jackson dying before he had a chance to shoot. But hey, this was the best they could come up with, and I told you already, Jackson was unhinged to say the least. By this time, dueling was actually illegal in the state of Tennessee, so the men crossed the border into Kentucky, and on the morning of May 30th, 1806, Jackson and Dickinson, along with their seconds, made their way to a secluded spot in Adderville. The two men marched to their positions 24 feet apart with their pistols in hand. The duel begins, and Dickinson expertly points his pistol at Jackson, aiming for his chest. He pulls the trigger, and in a flash of gun smoke, sends a lead ball hurtling towards Jackson and scores a direct hit inches from his heart. The former senator staggers back, clutching his chest. Blood seeps out from beneath his hand, staining his shirt, but Jackson does not fall. Dickinson lowers his pistol in disbelief. His aim was true, and that was surely a kill shot. Dueling rules stated that now he must stand still and allow Jackson to take his shot. He looks across the field and can't believe what he's seeing. The injured Jackson, face white as a ghost, still clutching his chest with one hand, slowly raises his pistol and takes aim. Jackson pulls his trigger, and Dickinson winces, expecting an impact, but nothing happens. Jackson's gun has misfired. Now, dueling rules say that a misfire still counts as a shot, and the duel should have been over. But Jackson, he doesn't give a f*** about the rules and recocks his pistol and aims again. He pulls the trigger, and this time the shot rings out. The lead ball hits Dickinson square in the chest, and he falls to the ground. Though people try to save him, he bleeds out and passes away within 24 hours. Jackson's wound is examined by his doctors, and it's discovered that Dickinson's bullet has broken a few of his ribs and is so close to his heart it can't be removed safely. He recovers, but the bullet remains lodged in his chest for the rest of his life, causing him a lot of pain. Jackson's reputation took a major hit from the duel because, he kind of just murdered a guy in cold blood, but not enough to prevent him from becoming president in 1829, which just goes to show you can be a horrible person and still become president of the United States.
3 of your ex-boyfriends died. Sure, a few of my exes are dead.
That's 6.
Today, we're going over the most brutal stories of revenge in human history. Number 1, Olga and the Drevlians. We're starting this list with quite possibly one of the greatest ride-or-die stories in human history, when Olga of Kiev led one of the most terrifying and calculated tours of revenge following the brutal execution of her husband. It's the year 945, and Prince Igor is ruling over Kiev and Rus, an empire that once stretched over modern-day Ukraine, Bulgaria, and a bit of Russia. To his west lived the Drevlians, a tribe who actually kind of hated the Kievan Rus, but occasionally fought alongside them against the Byzantine Empire. When Igor's father Oleg dies in 912, the Drevlians see it as an opportunity to finally stop paying their tribute, aka their forced protection money, to these assholes in Kiev. Igor patiently waits for his money for 33 years until finally deciding, you know what? 34 years would be just too long, and personally travels to the Drevlian capital city of Korostin to collect his money himself. He rode into the city with a large army and demanded tribute, which the Drevlians begrudgingly paid. And that should have been the end of it, and Igor should have gone on to live a long, happy life. But on his ride home, he feels the tribute was just a little too small, so he turns around with a few of his men and heads back to Korostin to demand more. When Igor arrives back at the city and begins shouting his demands, the Drevlians surprisingly do not like this and immediately kill his men. Igor was saved for an extra horrific execution. The Drevlians bent 2 birch trees toward each other and tied one of Igor's legs to each tree. Once Igor's legs were fastened, they cut the supports and the trees snapped back to their original form, ripping Igor into 2 pieces. The Drevlians' ruler, Prince Mal, was now feeling pretty good about himself and set his sights on taking over the larger empire by marrying Igor's widow, Olga. And this is where things all went downhill for the Drevlians, because Olga, she was the wrong person to mess with. Prince Mal sends 20 of his best ambassadors to Kiev to inform Olga what had happened to her husband, and to propose that she marry him to combine their territory. Surprisingly, she seems to take this news well, and tells the messengers that they should go back to their boat to rest for now, and that tomorrow her men would bring them back to the city to get her. The next morning, Olga's men walk down to the shore to get the ambassadors, but instead of just leading them into the city, they pick up their entire boat with all 20 men still in it. The ambassadors are blown away by this hospitality. What service? They're being treated like royalty! Until the ride suddenly got really bumpy. See, all through the night, Olga had her men digging a huge trench, and when her men arrived with the Drevlian ambassadors, she ordered them to dump the boat and all the men on board into this huge hole. She then orders them to bury these messengers alive. The Drevlians can do nothing as dirt is slowly piled on them, and soon they're buried alive. But Olga was just getting started. She then sends her own messengers to Korostin to ask Prince Mal to send his most distinguished men to Kiev to escort his soon-to-be bride. The Drevlians, not knowing what happened to the first group, comply and send a party of lords and powerful men as escorts. When they arrive in Kiev, Olga tells these distinguished guests to relax in a bathhouse her men had prepared, and that she would meet with them after they've freshened up. Her men lead the Drevlian nobles to the bathhouse, and once they're in, her men lock the doors and set the bathhouse and all the men inside on fire. Olga then sends more messengers to Korostin, asking Prince Mal to prepare for her arrival. She has one request. She wants a feast to mourn her late husband before the marriage. The Drevlians, again, not really knowing what's going on in Kiev, prepare a grand feast for Olga. She arrives, the party begins, and she encourages the Drevlians to drink and mourn with her. They do, and by the end of the night, the Drevlians are all properly hammered. Olga then orders her men to begin killing the now drunk and defenseless Drevlians. Surprise! Her men were sandbagging their drinks the whole night and were stone cold sober. Historians say Olga was seen cheering her men on as they went around slaughtering thousands of Drevlians, including Prince Mal himself. Olga then returned to Kiev to raise an army to finish them off once and for all. The Drevlians finally catch the hint that Olga maybe wasn't too fond of them when she returned to Koristan with a massive army and began a siege on the city. For over a year, the citizens of Koristan suffered with little food or supplies, until finally, Olga sends a message saying basically, if you just pay your tribute, this can all be over. Having been already fooled 3 times, and not really wanting to be fooled again, the Drevlians say they will pay the tribute, but are scared that Olga will still kill them. She responds and was like, oh, I know I got a little crazy there after Igor, but it's fine now. Just send me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house, and I'll go away. The Drevlians think this is a weird request, but are so relieved that their nightmare is finally coming to an end that they quickly go out and find the birds to give her. That night, Olga has her men tie a small piece of sulfur bundled in cloth to each bird's leg. They set fire to the cloth and release the birds into the night. Olga and her men watch 1,000 tiny embers fly off into the distance, and the birds go straight to their nests built on buildings in Koristan. Within hours, the entire city is a fiery hellscape. Olga watched the city burn to the ground and later claimed all Drevlian territory for herself. So yeah, they really should have just paid the tribute. Number 2, Caesar and the pirates. This next story is one where I actually feel kind of a little sorry for the would-be bad guys. It's the year 75 BCE, and a 25-year-old Roman nobleman named Julius Caesar was sailing the Aegean Sea heading to Rhodes. Along the way, his ship is boarded by Sicilian pirates, and Julius is taken captive. Now, becoming a hostage is usually a terrifying situation for most people, but in this case, I think the pirates knew right from the start they might have made a huge mistake. The pirates take a look at Caesar with his fancy clothes and entourage and realize he's probably somebody important, so they set a ransom for 20 talents, worth around $2 million today, give or take $1 million. When Caesar hears this number, he's offended and demands that they up the ransom to 50 talents. He sends his entourage to gather the money to buy his freedom, and he would remain as the pirates' hostage until they came back with the money. The pirates then sail off with Caesar and just a few of his men to their island hideout. Now, aboard the pirate ship, Caesar simply refuses to be a prisoner. In fact, the entire time he's held hostage, he acts as if they were all on his ship, and these pirates are his men. He freely walks around the ship, eats with the pirates, joins in on their games, and even exercises with them. He shushes them to be quiet when they're being noisy, and every day he forces them to listen to the speeches and poems he's working on. And that is why the Senate's power is but an illusion, maintained merely by tradition and weak men. Rome needs a leader who can see beyond petty politics and guide her to true greatness, perhaps even by force if necessary. You guys are all fucking idiots, aren't you?
Creating a voiceover with AI can be a real mission. Most of the voices sound pretty...
The pirates were confused as they never had a prisoner behave in such a strange way, but they put up with Caesar because he was kind of charismatic, and he was also kind of their ticket to a huge payday. It's also worth mentioning that throughout his time as a hostage, Caesar would joke that one day he would crucify them all for this. Once you guys let me go, I'm gonna find you guys and crucify every single one of you. I'm totally serious. You're all gonna be so sorry. 38 days later, Caesar's men return with the 50 talents, and Caesar is set free. The pirates sail back to their island base with their huge jackpot to get drunk, having achieved financial independence. Caesar, however, did no such relaxing, and immediately he goes out, raises a small army, and sails right back to the pirates' island. He takes back the 50 talents his men had just given them for the ransom and captures every single one of the pirates who held him captive. Caesar then crucified all of them, just like he promised. To Caesar's credit, he actually did grow a little fond of these pirates, so he slit their throats first to prevent them from suffering for a long time. What a nice guy. Number 3, the 47 Ronin. We go from pirates who were too dumb to know what was coming to a story of extreme loyalty when 47 samurai patiently waited for 2 years to avenge the death of their fallen master. This story begins in 1701 with 2 young daimyo named Kame and Asano, and a man named Kira, a member of the shogun's court tasked with instructing the 2 young lords in proper etiquette. Now, Kira, he was a giant douchebag. but because he was close to the shogun, he basically could get away with anything. The story goes that when Kame and Asano traveled to Edo, the two young lords brought gifts, aka bribes, that Kira felt were not big enough. So Kira pretty much spends every day calling them names and overall being a giant asshole. Both young lords were not used to being treated so poorly, but Asano does his best to maintain his composure. Kame, on the other hand, can't take it and decides to assassinate Kira himself. His counselors catch wind of this plan and behind Kame's back pay Kira a huge bribe for him to stop. With this, Kira unknowingly saves his own life and he begins to treat Kame much better. Asano, on the other hand, never got the memo about the bribe thing, and so Kira, now left with only one target, ramped up his insults in his direction. One fateful day, while walking together in Edo Castle, Kira is still running his mouth calling Asano a country hick with no manners. Asano finally snaps. He pulls out a